Hello, Professor Diamond. It's my great pleasure to have you through a video conference. Today is day 3 of CAC, Global Summit 2020. And already we had many mayors and governors and many experts. And so we talked about how to overcome this global pandemic and also, the preparation of coming post-corona era. And the conversation with Professor Diamond is one of the most important parts of this global summit. And as you may know, Professor Diamond, you are very popular in Seoul, in Korea, because many Korean leaders have read your books, this, Guns, Germs, and Steers. Also, this book is Upheaval. So probably I can safely say that you are the very steady seller and bestseller in Korea. So what about your impression? Many Koreans are fan of you.
I am a fan of Korea. So I'm Jared Diamond. I'm a geographer. I teach at the University of California here in Los Angeles. I'm now speaking from the study of my wife in our house near my university, about 2 kilometers away. I have had a long involvement with Asia. For the last 40 years, I've been working in particularly Indonesia and Malaysia, but I have Japanese relatives by marriage, and I've been visiting Korea for the last 25 years as a result of my admiration for your wonderful writing system, Hangul. My only regret is that I'm not with you in person, but it's always a great pleasure for me to have something to do with Korea, particularly at this crucial time in world history when cities play such an important role. And it's a role that you are exploring in your conference on cities against COVID. Thank you for involving me.
We are our pleasure. And I was deeply impressed by your book, which is analyzing the whole civilizations and at the different stage of history. And especially I'm very much learning from your books, with the comparative research on the civilizations which had been deployed for many, many centuries. So this time, I hope, this time will leave a great impression and insights to many audience, not only in Seoul, but also in many countries all over the world. So I'd like to talk about the current global pandemic, COVID-19. So it was broke out first in China, in Wuhan, at the end of December last year, but it has driven the entire world in chaos only within just 3 or 4 months. So some say that we need to prepare a new normal. And in particular, your book, The Upheaval, described a crisis based on its frequency, duration, and scale of the impact. And the crisis takes place in a brief moment, in a wide area, accompanying dramatic changes. So from this perspective, I think there is no other crisis than the COVID-19 pandemic that fits the definition of the crisis you described. It is triggering dramatic changes in a wide area in a split second. What do you think about this? I mean, how would you describe the impact of COVID-19 on humanity from the perspective of your crisis theory and transition.
COVID-19 is interesting to discuss from the perspective of my interest in crises, initially personal crises, a specialty of my wife, a psychologist, national crises, and the world crisis. On the one hand, one thinks there is nothing new about COVID. COVID seems such a familiar type of disease. It's a disease such as the infectious diseases that we've had throughout world history, such as the Black Death, such as smallpox and measles. In fact, it's a relatively mild disease. COVID kills only maybe 2% of its victims, whereas smallpox and plague killed 50% of their victims, and AIDS kills 100%. So one might begin by saying COVID is an old type of disease, there's nothing new. But there are two things new about COVID. One is that COVID is a pandemic. It's a disease around the whole world. Until recently, it was not possible to have worldwide diseases because there was not rapid communication. When the Black Death, plague, hit China and then Europe, plague could not spread to Australia nor the Americans because there was not rapid transportation. The first pandemic, the first disease that spread around the world, was the influenza at the end of World War I, made possible by fast steamships. Now, this ordinary disease, COVID, is spreading around the world not by fast steamships, but by jet planes. And so that's something new. The other thing that's new about COVID, besides the rapid spread, besides it's being a pandemic, is that COVID is a disease to which nobody has immunity. The diseases of the past, like smallpox, when Europeans brought smallpox to the New World, Europeans had experience of smallpox. They had protection, they had immunity, genetic immunity, antibodies, whereas Native Americans had none. But in the case of COVID, COVID is a new disease. Nobody has immunity to COVID. Every people in the world is susceptible to COVID. That's something new. What I would like also to emphasize for the purposes of our conference, where each country is evaluating countermeasures against COVID. This is new. The world is carrying out experiments. Different countries are adopting different countermeasures. Some countries are adopting a lockdown, closing down as tightly as possible. Some countries are not adopting a lockdown. Sweden, for example, decided not to have a lockdown, but decided to see whether it could build up herd immunity by letting everybody, especially young people, get infected. Within my own country, within the United States, there are experiments. My own state of California, the governor of my state, acted quickly and adopted the first lockdown in the United States. But other states in the United States, such as Georgia and Mississippi, have acted much more passively. So the world is carrying out a gigantic experiment, how best to respond to this disease. And we don't yet know the outcome of the experiment. It appears that the Swedish attempt to avoid lockdown is not working out as well as was hoped in Sweden. Other countries like Vietnam that adopted quickly a severe lockdown seem to be doing well, but in short, this familiar disease, this apparently mild disease, is now a new phenomenon, a global disease, thanks to jet airplanes, and the world, the cities of the world are experimenting with how best to solve it, and we don't yet know the outcome of this experiment.
Great. You made description, how different countries are, dealing with this global pandemic differently, in different way. Is the reaction or response against this COVID-19 is maybe different, and Seoul and Korea's response are very much renowned to other countries in the name of K quarantine. So, we were successful until now to slow down the expansion of this disease, and also, leaving only 4 death tolls in Seoul. So compared to the whole population, more than 10 million living in this metropolitan area. So in that sense, this evaluation abroad is very much suggestive. And so I can explain the characteristics of our response to COVID-19, based on the lesson we learned from the MERS 5 years ago in 2015, when the first COVID-19 case was confirmed. Seoul City immediately dispatched a rapid response team and also, tested many people as quickly as possible. So then Seoul has been tasking bold actions by tracking whereabouts of the confirmed cases and isolating those who came into contact with them and disclosing every information to the public. So that way, the citizens themselves can take precaution to prevent these infections. So Seoul also took innovative actions, methods like drive-through or walk-through screening centers and anonymous tests and so on. So you pointed out that the elements defining the development of human civilization are strong social institutions and technology and optimal fragmentation principle. So Seoul's anti-epidemic efforts can also be explained by these 3 elements as well. Seoul and Korea has the running a national healthcare insurance system programs that covers all the citizens. And also we have public hospitals all over the country and own the virus test kits of the world-class accuracy. So, and second, we used various cutting-edge technologies also in the process of responding to COVID-19. When tracking the movements of the confirmed cases, we analyzed the information like credit transactions, credit card transactions, and mobile phone records, and CCTV footages. Third, Seoul also experienced, alongside strong collective intelligence, where citizens are willing to, voice their opinions, discuss, and reach a consensus. This was clearly demonstrated in Candlelight Revolution, 2 years ago. And also, so I can safely say that the victory against the, pandemic was the wholly, should be attributed to the citizens. And so our citizens actively took the lead in virus containment and voluntarily following the guidelines of sanitation. So, how do you evaluate the different efforts and measures taken by each different countries?
To me, as an American, this is fascinating, the differences between countries and the difference that you describe between Korea's response and the American response. In the case of Korea, you emphasize that your response was immediate. In the United States, our response was not immediate. We lost weeks, we lost maybe a month, and the estimate is that our delay cost us maybe several tens of thousands of deaths, whereas your immediate response saved you tens of thousands of deaths. Another difference between Korea and the United States is that my sense is that Koreans are more willing to cooperate and to accept direction from their government. The United States is at the opposite extreme. The United States, along with Australia, is the most individualistic country in the world. Americans are disposed not to accept the advice from their government. And so, for example, here in California, in my state of California, until recently we had a lockdown. A few days ago, our governor relaxed the lockdown, but there are many people here in my city of Los Angeles who are not following the direction of wearing masks, who walk on the street. On my street last night, when my wife and I took a walk on my street, we saw people without masks walking next to each other. The government tells us not to do that, but Americans are less disposed to accept direction from their government than Koreans. And we are paying the price for that. The largest number of deaths in the world is now in the United States. In short, it seems to me that the world in general, and we Americans in particular, have a lot to learn from Korea and from your own capital city in how to respond quickly, in the advantages of an excellent healthcare system, in your free hospitals, and in your willingness to accept the direction from good ideas on the part of your leaders.
Thank you very much for your good comment. I would like to move next, about the post-corona civilizations. So actually, in fact, not just Seoul, but Korea as a whole has not received a favorable evaluation regarding climate change. We have not taken care of our environment, until recently. After we had suffered so many, tragic history. We were colonized and divided after the liberation in 1945, and we also, met the Korean War. The whole casualties is around 1 million citizens and soldiers at the time, and everything was demolished, and then we experienced, the dictatorship. So with these hardships and difficulties, we overcome. But also we, did make an industrial success, the so-called miracle of Han River, but were not able to stop the environmental pollutions. So with the inauguration of my mayorship in 2011, so I decided to turn this trend. So I can point out that I brought a package of climate change programs. The first is the one lease nuclear power plant. So I invited the citizens to participate in this project. So by producing the renewable energy and saving the energy at the same time, so we were very much successful in attaining the goal of amount of 3 nuclear power plants energies. So also the second project is the solar city. I mean, our aim was establishing 1 million photovoltaic panels in 1 million households of Seoul citizens. So, and also the third is the Seoul Declaration, Seoul's promise to handle the climate change with companies and our citizens. So, by 2030, we aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% compared to 2005. We also will carry out a Green New Deal in earnest, turning Seoul more green. We will turn our urban infrastructure green by making a large financial investment in buildings, transportations, and waste management to become a zero carbon city by 2050. So we are truly ready to transform ourselves from environmental villain to a green hero. So how do you expect the post-corona transportation of civilization in Korea and in the world together?
The problem that you've mentioned of environmental problems in general and climate problems in particular, those problems I see as the most serious problems in the world today. They are more serious than the problem of COVID. It seems terrible for me to say that when COVID is such a tragedy. During the last 3 weeks, my wife and I have suffered the deaths of 5 of our closest, longest-term friends. So this is a tragic time for us, which I fully understand. But the fact is that the bigger problems of the world are the environmental problems. Environmental problems have the potential of killing far more people than COVID and of causing more permanent damage. Just as an example, because we're talking about diseases, COVID as a disease, climate change also is having effects on the spread of diseases through the world. Yes, there are new emerging diseases, of which COVID is one, but there are old diseases which are spreading through the world to areas where they were not before as a result of climate change. In particular, tropical diseases, diseases that used to be confined to the tropics. With global warming, those diseases are now spreading into cooler climates, which means that some tropical diseases have already reached the United States, and the expectation is that they will also reach Korea. For example, diseases such as malaria and dengue fever that we think of as tropical diseases are spreading. An African disease called chikungunya fever, which used to be confined to Uganda. About 10 years ago, the first case of chikungunya fever appeared in Italy, of all places. That's a result of climate change. So you are correct to be concerned about climate change, which has so many consequences for our air quality, consequences for our agriculture, consequences for our drought, consequences for the spread of diseases. It's a problem that affects the whole world. It affects you. It affects us acutely in California, because California is agriculturally the most productive part of the United States. But California is getting dry, and so the breadbasket of the United States, a breadbasket of the world, California, is suffering from climate change. In short, I compliment you on taking the lead in dealing with this world problem of climate change, which frankly is a much more serious problem in the long run than is COVID.
So actually you mentioned in guns, germs, and steel that the geographical and ecological characteristics can determine the many aspects of people's lives. Then when global warming persists, what do you think will happen with the germs? I mean, do you think the germs or epidemics are likely to spread further? If so, and if we have to live with such virus together, what we can do?
In answer to your first question, yes, there are going to be more germs and more epidemics. And in answer to your second question, what can we do? We can be prepared. As for the spread of more germs, new germs arise in a number of ways. New diseases of humans arise especially from diseases of animals. If you think of the famous new diseases of humans in the last 40 or 50 years, they are AIDS, which arose from Africa, from our closest relatives, primates. They are mad cow disease that arose from a disease of cattle. They are SARS, which arose in wild animal markets in China. They are MERS, which arose through contact with camels. they are flu, and now they are COVID. So new diseases of humans arise from contact with animals, but there's contact with wild animals in the world, especially in wild animal markets, and through the traditional medicine trade, and through the bushmeat trade. So we have to expect more new diseases. COVID will not be the last new disease. And in addition, as I explained, we have to expect the spread of old diseases to new places where those diseases were not. Your second question about what can we do, a short answer about what we can do is be prepared. The world, by and large, was not prepared for COVID. A few countries were, but most of the world was not prepared. What the world needs to do, expecting that there will be new diseases, is to anticipate our response so that when a new disease arrives, we will be ready. In Korea, you were ready. You were ready with tracing, you were ready with your medical systems. Other countries were not ready. Vietnam was ready because Vietnam had a bad experience in 2002 from the spread of SARS in China. So Vietnam, like you, rapidly adopted tracing. And so Vietnam, like Korea, has had relatively few COVID cases, but most of the world has not been prepared. In short, your question about what we should do, we should think in advance about what problems may arise, not only problems of disease, but problems of electrical breakdown, problems of financial breakdown. Think out in advance how we would respond, have a plan, stockpile the devices, and be prepared.
Mm-hmm. Right. And, you also described the impact of germs on people in your book. For example, those who lived with domesticated animals were able to grow antibodies that are resistant to the animal-borne virtues that are resistant. And on the other hand, those who failed to do so ended up losing their lives due to the infection. So I clearly, understood that in your book, how the Spanish conquerors accompanied the germ to the aboriginal people in American continents. So in case of COVID-19, some argues that the virus originated from the wet market where wild animals were traded. So do you think this kind of trade should be prohibited in one of the way of preventive way for the COVID-19 or other disease?
Of course, yes. The major ways, the three principal ways that new diseases have emerged from wild animals in the last 50 years have been the wild animal markets, not only in China, but there are other countries with wild animal markets. Secondly, by what's called bushmeat trade, that's hunting of animals for food, especially in Africa. And third, the trade in animals for traditional medicines. People are accustomed to traditional medicines. People are accustomed to wild animal markets, but they produce devastating consequences. And so if we want to reduce the risk of new emerging diseases in the future, we have to close down the wild animal markets, close down the trade in animals for traditional medicines, and close down the bushmeat trade. One might say that all of those are very important to humans culturally, but there's a trade-off. What is more important to us? A cultural trait that kills people or keeping people alive? So again, in answer to your question, what should we do to reduce the risk of new emerging diseases in the future? They are to close down the animal markets, to stop the bushmeat trade, to reduce the trade in traditional medicines, but also more fundamentally to deal with climate change so that there will not be the spread of tropical diseases.
Right. I agree with your analysis and response. We human beings are destroying the wild forest and turning it into land to cultivate. So the wild animals had lost their paradise and their habitat to live in. So now the new civilization should be more ecological, enough to protect and guarantee for the animals, wild animals, can live in. So even in urban district in Seoul, we also try to restore some, land with trees and forest. For example, we Seoul metropolitan government and with the citizens had planted around 25 million trees within 8 years. So our final goal is to plant the trees, amounting 30 million trees in Seoul. And also, as much as possible, we are trying to turn the land into the park and so on. So I totally agree with your analysis. And so I would like to turn our topics to the inequality issues. I agree that social inequalities are getting worse. In particular, the infectious disease is disconnecting people's relationship and therefore causing a serious economic crisis. Such a crisis is hitting the vulnerable and underprivileged harder and deeper. So it's my belief that this kind of disaster and crisis is coming to the vulnerable first and the deep. So a lot of small business owners and the so-called platform gig workers are suffering a lot. I think this goes same for the US, but also in Korea and Seoul. A lot of people closed their business and lost jobs. So even from the beginning of this pandemic, Seoul's main focus was to protect our citizens' lives and ensure their stable livings. For this, we provided emergency allowance more quickly than any other city and offered various financial aids for small businesses, owners, and irregular workers. Now, we are pushing to introduce a universal employment insurance that covers all the working people. So I think we need to secure a tight safety net for the sake of human security in a society where unstable employment still remains. And there is high chance for the economy to shut down due to infectious disease at any time. So what is your reply and response to this to prevent more serious inequality in times of global, and pandemics?
My response is, in effect, to double what you said. By that, I mean that inequality is important at two levels. Inequality is important within a country, and inequality is important between countries. Talking about inequality within a country, in the United States, we have much experience now that although nobody started out with antibodies to COVID, nevertheless, some Americans are dying at higher rates than are other Americans. The highest mortality rates in the United States are among Native Americans and among African Americans, and they're lower among European Americans. Why? It's because of existing health problems. Poorer people who are in poorer health are more likely to die from COVID than other people. And that has consequences. Here in my city of Los Angeles, which is a city with great inequality, there are very wealthy people in Los Angeles and there are very poor people in Los Angeles. Right now, as we speak, and you've undoubtedly read about this, there have been riots going on in my city for the last several days. There are lockdowns, there are curfews at night. My son is with us in our house at the moment, but he's going to have to go home before 9 p.m. tonight because of curfews. Ultimately, this is because of inequality, poor people knowing that they are disadvantaged and rioting. So there's that problem of inequality within a country. There's a saying, a bitter saying within the United States: when will rich Americans start to become concerned about the problems of poor Americans? And the bitter answer to that is rich Americans will be concerned about the problems of poor Americans when rich Americans themselves feel endangered. That is happening now. The other side to inequality is inequality around the world, poorer countries and richer countries, and we can talk more about that. But let me stop now mentioning those two features of inequality.
Right. The inequality issue is not only confined to one country, one city. It's very universal, situation and issues which should be dealt in many other countries and many cities. And now I would like to, move our topics to the, next coming, the digital society. Seoul is preparing for a new normal in the long run. COVID-19 is changing a society more rapidly than ever. Now that we have advanced digital and smart technologies in place, a change to a non-contact society can take place even faster. Of course, the fourth industrial revolution is going on, but it will be faster. So working from home or virtual classes are becoming more common in Seoul, and new forms of art activities like online performance are increasing. So even now, we are holding this summit virtually, like this. So in a society, where changes are being made rapidly, so I think building a new standard is very much important. So what are you expecting, the next coming society and civilization in terms of such a, digital and untaxed society?
There are things that I'm expecting and that have already arrived for us, just as for you. You mentioned virtual connections. In the United States now, virtual connections. My university closed down in March. It closed down just after my last lecture and just before my final exam, so that my final exam was given not in person, but over the internet. In the summer now, my university is doing all of its teaching online, not in person. In the fall, my university will do all of its teaching online. And in the winter, when I will resume my teaching, I don't know yet whether I will be able to teach in person, which I love to do, or whether our teaching will be online. That's a small example of how so much of the economy and so much of the operation of our society has turned to online. And this is the case for you, and it's the case for us, and the case for the world. But the biggest change for the world, I think, is that the world, for the first time in world history now, faces a global problem that is recognized as a global problem. Never before has the world recognized that we face a global problem. Yes, there are really global problems, such as climate change that you've talked about, but the world has not rallied together and recognized climate change as a common enemy. Why? Because climate change kills people slowly, doesn't kill people quickly, and when someone dies of respiratory diseases or dies from decreased agricultural production, it's not easy to say that was due to climate change. In the case of COVID, when someone is infected with COVID, they may die within a few days. There's no doubt that they have died of COVID. So COVID is now recognized as a global threat for the first time in world history.
Thank you very much.
Citizens around the world are recognizing this global threat.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Professor Diamond. We would like to have 10 minutes break. Is it all right? And also,
It is all right.
Yeah, I'd like to ask the audience, to make questions. So, the last time I will ask to Professor Diamond. So, if you, make questions through this website and the YouTube, I will, make questions to the professor, and we will have 10 minutes, break time. Thank you. 이거로 들고 가야지. 초동 대응은 빠를수록 완벽할수록 이렇게 좋다. 그리고 그것에 지금 사활이 걸려 있다. 이렇게 저는 말씀드리고 싶습니다.
The daily average of confirmed COVID-19 cases in Seoul is reported as 2.9, despite a series of mass infection crises. Seoul has a population of over 10 million. It is a densely populated metropolis with a high risk of virus infection, but no city lockdown has been made. Fast preemptive response and transparent provision of information. Centering on these two principles, the Seoul Metropolitan Government cooperated closely with Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The city government has operated the Seoul Disaster and Safety Countermeasures Headquarters for 24 hours a day from the early stages to monitor new infectious diseases and disinfected public transportations and facilities used by many citizens and visitors. Seoul, while monitoring the virus, had also prepared necessary countermeasures against the COVID-19, such as citizens' guidelines, virus testing, contacts management, and quarantine treatment. To contain the virus to not spread to the local community, Seoul was committed to conducting epidemiological investigation, quarantine treatment, and identifying and tracking patients and contacts. Seoul now becomes a model for cities around the world in terms of the COVID-19 quarantine measures. At the request of cities overseas, the Seoul Metropolitan Government opened an online platform entitled CAC, which stands for Cities Against COVID-19, on April 9th, and has been sharing all information on the COVID-19 quarantine know-hows and countermeasures Seoul has taken so far. However, Seoul has not completely succeeded in COVID-19 quarantine. The first crisis came to Seoul in March, after the country's first outbreak of COVID-19 in January. A mass infection occurred at a call center in Guro District.
서울에서 발생한 집단 감염 가운데 최대 규모의 사례가 나왔습니다.
27명이 추가로 확진된 겁니다.
집단 발생 즉각 대응반을 구성해서 역학 조사를 실시하고 있습니다. 미중하게 이 상황을 인식하고 추가 확산을 막기 위해서 최선을 다하고 있습니다.
Using mobile access records and credit card transactions, the city government identified more than 1,000 contacts and conducted tests for COVID-19. The government asked for citizens for active cooperation for self-quarantine to prevent a second or third transmission of the virus to the community. Call centers and public facilities across Seoul were disinfected thoroughly.
서울시는 시민 모두가 저희들이 그 요청한 대로의 생활 방역을 철저히 해주셨고, 확진 환자 유증상이 발생했을 시에는 각 보건소에 적극적으로 검사를 임함으로써 저희들이 효과를 거두지 않았나 이렇게 생각을 합니다.
After the switch from the social distancing to the distancing in daily life in May, an unexpected mass infection occurred at clubs in Itaewon. Based on the experience of mass infection at the Guro call center, the city government tracked down the Itaewon visitors working together with the National Police Agency and the mobile service companies. The Seoul Metropolitan Government immediately introduced the anonymous testing and operated additional walk-through testing stations.
저희가 서울시에서 4개 드라이빙 스루를 운영하면서 수많은 외신 기자들이 취재 요청이 있어서 중소기업 쪽에서 지침도 협조가 오르면 그런 걸 많이 제공한 걸로 알고 있습니다. 서울시에서는 6월 초부터 선제적 검사가 해가지고 학생이라든지 어린이들, 감염에 취약한 분들이 있는 장소들을 찾아가서 선제 검사가 지금 검토 중입니다.
As the number of confirmed cases is rising, Seoul is once again checking quarantine countermeasures against COVID-19 and conducting preemptive virus testings. The distancing in daily life has been further tightened. We must stay alert to this unpredictable virus.
And they are going through a sort of more stringent lockdown than we've had here in South Korea, because the South Korean government and I guess the Seoul government have dealt with the coronavirus in kind of unique ways, particularly in terms of testing and contact tracing and, targeted quarantining. The country's been a little bit more successful in keeping the number of cases and the number of deaths down. Well, I think the most important part of, so-called K quarantine is the contact tracing that needs to take place. In order to contain the virus, you need to know where it came from. And that means that, Western countries, the publics in Western countries are going to need to sacrifice some of their privacy in order for contact tracing to be really effective. That's the biggest lesson that I think other countries and other governments can learn from South Korea's experience in containing the virus.
Along with the immediate response of the government, dedication of the frontline medical workers, and participation of citizens who practice social distancing made it possible for Korea to be a role model in quarantine measures. Yet, COVID-19 will leave much of an impact on our society. It has changed our daily lives, and economic and social damages are also significant. For any possible outbreak in the future, what should we do to prepare? For the world after COVID-19, how can cities in the world cooperate with each other? Now, the world is paying attention to Seoul's next move.
Okay. Professor Diamond, have you enjoyed the video clip?
I've enjoyed it and I've learned from it. Thank you.
Right, thank you. And so I want to move our topic on the new normal issues. I mean, you know, Seoul is now experimenting a new way of living. I mean, which is living with virus without shutting down, you know, our everyday life and economy. So I expect the Seoul's model will attract attention continuously because we are for the first time in the world continuing, you know, our daily life while controlling, you know, an infectious disease at the same time. And so I think the world already stepped into the you know, post-coronavirus society once the outbreak of coronavirus took place. So in such a post-coronavirus world, how should cities change? In particular, how should metropolis like Seoul make a transition in order to better respond to epidemics?
How should cities make a change? This is an example of a more general question of how to deal with crises. How should people deal with crises, personal crises, breakup of a marriage, a business setback, a health crisis? How should nations deal with crises? How should the world deal with crises? There are a dozen factors that are familiar to any of us who've experienced a personal crisis. In dealing with a personal crisis, it's important to acknowledge, to take responsibility. But one important feature in dealing with a crisis, whether it's personal or national crisis, is the importance of models. That's to say, to model your response on another country or city or person that has faced a similar crisis and dealt well with it, and avoid taking as a model a country or person that has failed to respond well to a crisis. In that respect, Seoul, although it's a city of Korea, although it's a country of 40, 50 million people, it's not a large fraction of the world's population, but Korea has potentially an enormous importance for the whole world as a model. Other countries can look at what Korea has done, what Seoul has done, and can learn how you have been dealing successfully with your crisis, whereas other countries, many other countries, have been dealing unsuccessfully. So there's the opportunity for the world to learn from Seoul and Korea. There's also the opportunity for the world to learn from countries that refuse to learn from models. My own country, the United States, because we Americans emphasize what we call American exceptionalism. We Americans think that the United States is so exceptional that we have nothing to learn from other countries. But other countries, Canada, Korea, Japan, Western Europe, Australia, other countries face the problems that we face, problems of democracy, problems of disease, problems of education. But we Americans are reluctant to learn from other countries. That's greatly to our disadvantage. So in short, the significance of Seoul and your response is not only in making life safe and prosperous for your citizens, but also as serving as a model for the whole world from which the whole world can learn.
I think we should learn each other, you know, all the time. My next question is about the world order in the post-coronavirus, you know, era. So I understand that when you wrote the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, you wanted to know how different part of the world hold different level of power and wealth. So in such uneven development derived from environmental differences, which ultimately led to inequalities in wealth and power. So infectious disease in our modern society, like coronavirus, will, I believe, may bring great changes in civilizations, more so in the global power and wealth climate. So at this moment, the U.S. and China are in fierce competition to seize the hegemony. So in many countries also come into conflict with their neighboring nations. So how do you think the global order will change in these situations? What about the order in Northeast Asia? So just as the Spanish conquerors shifted the focus on civilizations with the spread of germs or epidemics, how would COVID-19 change our future civilizations and powers?
Here is how I think that COVID will change our future civilizations and power. And here is how I hope that COVID will change the world. There's much discussion of competition between China and the United States and Europe. There's discussion of whether the result of COVID will be a shift in power around the world. But I think and I hope that the biggest consequence of COVID will be to end discussion about competition between different parts of the world for power and to create discussion that the whole world will, as we say, sink or swim together. Perhaps one of the most important messages of COVID is that no country in the world will be safe from COVID as long as any country in the world continues to have COVID. China alone cannot protect itself. The United States alone cannot protect itself because we will just get reinfected from other countries. COVID is an example of a global problem that demands a global solution. I hope the world will recognize that it requires a global solution. But my hope then is that if the world has learned from COVID that this global problem can be solved only at a global level, and that it is silly to talk about competition between China and the United States. I hope that the world will learn that other global problems also have to be solved at a global level. You talked about climate change. Climate change, if you solve the problem of climate change in Korea by reducing the output of greenhouse gases in Korea, the atmosphere in Korea is mixed with the atmosphere with the whole world. Climate change cannot be solved by one country at a time. Climate change requires a global solution. Again, resource exploitation of fisheries and forests requires a global solution. And therefore, I would like to be optimistic. I would like to say that my hope for COVID is that we'll teach the world that global problems such as COVID and climate change require global solutions, and that perhaps COVID will have taught the world reluctantly, finally, to stop thinking of competition between different parts of the world and to recognize that we all have to work together to solve world problems, because if we don't work together, we will all fail together.
So I totally agree with your analysis that the whole world is really interconnected. So, since COVID-19, some countries closed their borders and also now keeping a great distance from others. However, I think, the cutting off the relations and isolating from each other in the current situation is not the option for us, especially when the world is connected more than ever by one network. So rather, I think we need to come together in solidarity and cooperation. So I've already made a donation of medical supplies to Seoul's citizen-friendly cities, including Wuhan, with a message of hope and encouragement. So I understand that there was a criticism regarding this in early stage, but I believe that only solidarity, can make solutions. So, solidarity and cooperation can save all of us from the crisis of the virus. So, and as you may know, Seoul never closed our border and did not stop people coming from overseas to enter our country and our city. But still, we managed to contain the spread of the virus. So perhaps this holds significant implications for building a global standard for infectious disease controls. So I'd like to share such message with the world. I want to try this together with the world, not leaving any city or any country behind. We are hosting this very summit for the same reasons. So I already suggested to establish an intercity network under the tentative name called CAP, CAAP, Cities Alliance Against Pandemic, in a spirit of global cooperation and solidarity for anti-epidemic efforts. So we'll continue to take actions to address global epidemic with other cities and countries. I would like to share such method with the world. I want to try this together with the world, not leaving any city or country behind. So, we are hosting this very summit for the same reasons. And so how do you think how we should make efforts to overcome this COVID-19 crisis without such hatred or stopping the mutual relations and so on?
We have no choice. There is no alternative. If any country tries to protect itself by borders, for a short time that might work, but for a long time it won't work, because in this globalized world, people move around too easily and too quickly. If any one or two countries, if Mongolia or Bolivia or Afghanistan or any country remains a part of COVID, the whole world is endangered. And that's why I say we have no choice except to cooperate together, Because if we don't cooperate, all of us will be ruined by COVID, and all of us will be ruined by climate change. The world now is in the same boat. We will, as one says, sink or swim together.
I'm very happy to hear that. So we have an option, to cooperate each other. Actually, I understand that you usually show deep interest in Korean culture and our potentials. And you are also highly praised our writing system, Hangul. So as you may know, Korea has experienced several crises and changes over time. As I mentioned before, colonizations, division of the country, and the Korean War, and dictatorship, and industrialization, democratizations. So, I would like to ask you, you would like to include this Korean case in your next book, or in adding the Korean chapter in your book?
I'm not going to wait for my next book. I already frequently talk about Korea. Ever since I discovered Hangul and your wonderful writing system, I've talked about Korea. I talk to my university students each year about your wonderful writing system. I've taken pleasure in visiting your country ever since about 1997. I visited 5 times. I enjoy the Korean people. My only regret for us today is that you and I are not able to meet in person and shake hands in person, that we have to talk virtually. But I look forward to returning to your wonderful country, which is a model, again to use that word model, a model to the world for how a country can rapidly prosper, take advantage of its history, achieve a high economic performance in a short time, and serve as a model to the world for how to deal with COVID, and serve as a model to the world in so many other respects. I love your country. I shall return whenever invited.
Thank you very much. And if you have any intention to write about the Korean Peninsula in your next book, I'd like to invite you providing a good lunch or, very delicious Korean traditional food and so on. All right?
That is a very appetizing invitation.
Great, thank you. Actually, reading this book, I found that you dealt with the Japanese case, including the Meiji period and modern Japan. So I think the Korean, Peninsula Korean case is also deserve to be dealt with by you, twice in next book. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to move to the questions raised by the audience. So I selected 3 of them. So I will make questions to you, representing the audience. The first question is, in a time when we have to coexist with the virus, there is no question that cities that are densely populated will have to change how they are. Close-packed work environments and large-scale, multi-purpose facilities are a good way of making profits thanks to their efficiency and productivity, especially in a city where high rental fees were very common. But however, this has instead become the greatest risk factor for cities. So how do you see the future of global megacities? This is the first question. May I continue, or you will answer for each question?
I would prefer to answer for each question,
okay,
because I tend to get involved in my answers as I will forget the previous question. Your first question about dense cities. Yes, obviously, the danger of infection is greater in a dense city than in a rural area. Within my own country, the United States, the American state other than California that I know best is Montana, where my wife and I spend our vacations. Montana has the lowest population density in the United States. And not surprisingly, there's not much problem of COVID in Montana because people don't meet each other often. There's an acute problem of COVID in New York City, our biggest city, but also here in Los Angeles. What can one do about it? In Los Angeles, we have lockdown, but we are also doing work virtually. My university has not closed down. We're continuing to teach. We're having to discover new ways of teaching. They're not the ways that we would have chosen, but we are learning to adapt. So mega cities are not going to disappear. We have a big investment in them. We have to learn. We are learning how to operate mega cities in a different way now that we cannot meet each other face to face. And then with vaccines, this is going to change already next year.
Mm-hmm. Many experts are expecting that, 60% of whole population in the world will live in urban cities until, 10 or 20 years later. So, do you think this trend, tendency, and expectation will be changing? I mean, there may be some disperse of urban population into, rural area and so on?
I don't think that this trend will change. There are big reasons behind the change. The reasons include that there are advantages to being in cities. It is wonderful to be in Los Angeles. It is wonderful to be in Seoul, Tokyo, Berlin. I choose to live in a big city. That's one reason. Another reason is that agriculture is getting increasingly so productive that one can produce a lot of food on smaller amounts of land. So the trend towards larger cities is not going to change. The only thing that will change is learning how to reconcile densely populated cities with the risk of diseases, and we are learning it now, and you are serving as a model to us of how to live in a densely populated city and coexist with a new disease.
Great, thank you. And this next question is, a return of localization can be interpreted differently as dispersion of concentrated resources. What do you think should be the strategy that global megacities like New York, Paris, and Seoul should adopt during such a time of major social change? It's a very similar question. So do you think there is time for global megacities to give up on the benefits of resource concentrations?
Some resources are concentrated whether we like it or not. Examples are fisheries. Fish are not uniformly distributed around the world. Particularly valuable fish like tuna go in schools. Those are concentrated global resources. The world is learning how to manage global resources. In the past, each country had its own resources, each country had its own fisheries and managed its own fisheries. But now, Korea and Japan are importing a lot of their seafood. That means that if the fisheries of the world get depleted, then Korea and Japan and the European Union suffer. So an issue for the world today is to manage global resources, not just local resources, but also global resources. And that applies particularly to fisheries, secondly to forests, thirdly to topsoil, and fourthly to water. Those are perhaps the four most important world resources that have to be managed globally.
Great. So, third question. A city or government can only deal with the aftermath of COVID-19 outbreaks. This is characteristics of democratic government. So as a cultural anthropologist who predicts the future, is there any way, a way to suppress the amplification of virus in advance through a more creative method, perhaps something similar to social distancing? Also, is human intimacy unavoidable? Is human intimacy unavoidable? I'd like to hear your valuable opinion on this. The third question.
That's an interesting question. The question of human intimacy. It's a very real question for me because I have two very close friends who are not married or whose marriages have broken up and who are exploring these issues of human intimacy. One of my close friends before COVID had intimate relationships with 9 ladies, all of whom he loved dearly. But as a result of COVID, he now has an intimate relationship with just 1 lady. She is a wonderful lady. He would have liked to have the intimate relationships with 8 other ladies, but that is not possible. So yes, COVID is introducing social changes in human relations.
Actually, this COVID-19 and this pandemic is providing a great stress to the citizens because they were isolated for a long time as a result of social distancing. So we are trying to provide more opportunities for them to get cured in many ways. But reading your book, you had the crisis when you were selecting your major in England, and you spent 1 year of chaotic times. But your kind father advised in very wise and intelligent way. So I was very much moved, by this scene you had encountered in your young age. So do you have any, advice or the, the words of consolation with those who are suffering from this stress? Not only for Korean, but also worldwide, the audiences.
It's a big issue and one that's very real for me. It's real for me partly because my wife, Marie, is a clinical psychologist. She helps people dealing with stress, and now Marie has many of her clients who are under stress, but Marie, as a psychologist, can no longer see her clients face to face. She has learned to, quote, see her clients using her cell phone, using media such as FaceTime, that's to say, finding alternatives. For me, I have many dear friends with whom, under normal conditions, I meet for lunch once a week, or I meet for a breakfast once a month. That is no longer possible. I've had to find substitutes. My substitutes include talking with friends over Zoom. I would rather be with them in person, but I would much rather talk with them over Zoom than not talk with them at all. And another way that I've done it is that one good friend of mine, I meet out of doors. We no longer meet inside the house, but we meet out of doors and we walk up the street 2 meters from each other. So yes, there is stress from social isolation, but we have to think of ways to get around this stress. And there are ways. They're not ways that we would have chosen. Yes, it would be much nicer to sit next to someone and hug someone. But as long as that's not possible, we can still meet with people online and we can meet with people out of doors. And that's what I'm doing.
Okay, thank you. And so, Seoul metropolitan government is trying to make the city of Seoul a city of humanities. I mean, we are investing some resources to cultivate the soil on which the more, intellectuals in humanities would grow and mature. So that is the reason why there are so many Korean readers reading with your books like this, and so every parents in Korea want to educate their children with or sacrificing their lives. So in my case, my parents was really poor farmers in remote countryside, but they sent me to Seoul and to be educated. The being educated in the universities is not our final goal. We should have more, environment for humanities is more prosperous. So, how you can make advice to us to make our societies or Seoul city to be more, such a humanistic city?
One piece of advice, one way to think of it, is to think of living your life in a way such that your children and grandchildren will enjoy a good life. A friend of mine is the head of, at my university, a sustainability program. My University of California has a sustainability program of which my friend happens to be the head. And I recall an occasion when I was walking with my friend on the street, we encountered a neighbor who had never heard about sustainability programs. And he asked my friend, so what is a sustainability program? And her answer was, a sustainability program means creating a world in which your children and grandchildren will also have a good world. Not just a good world for you alone, but also a good world for you and your grandchildren. And that means many things. I can understand when you say, coming from a poor rural area, my grandfather immigrated from Eastern Europe in 1902. He was very poor. My father grew up in a poor part of New York City, had to learn about education himself. My parents then taught the value of education to my sister and me, and now my children are 33 years old. I have twin sons. My wife and I are trying to create a good world for my children. The reason that I began to write books, the reason why I have books, is that when my twin sons were born, I realized that the future of the world depends upon history and geography. And so I began writing books for a wide public in order to help create a world that is good for the world of my sons. And that's why you have my books, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and Upheaval and Collapse, in the hopes of creating a world that will be a good world for my sons and their generation.
Thank you very much for your heartfelt response. And so, the conversation with you gave a great guidance to me and our citizens, and also probably to many audience in other countries, in other cities. And in particular, our conversation also gives a lot of implications and inspirations to Korean society and Seoul at our new turning point. So as you recently said in an interview, the whole world is on the same boat with COVID-19. So now we have to live with virus. So I think that in this society, the role of great global scholars like you is more important than ever in the future. So please continue to give us a lot of guidance and advice. So finally, do you have anything you want to say to people around the world? And do you have any plans to come to Korea and to learn Hangul and study more about Korea?
Yes, what I would say to people all around the world is that if you have not yet visited Korea, take the opportunity to visit Korea as soon as it is possible to do so, because it is a wonderful country. And as far as learning Hangul is concerned, each time that I teach world geography to my students at UCLA, I write up on the board Hangul letters, but in my class, I have Korean students, and my Korean students come to the board and correct my not quite exact writing of Hangul letters. I look forward to returning to Korea with great pleasure.
Thank you very much. You must be our ambassador. Thank you very much. And you spent so much time, explaining sincerely to our citizens and to the audience of all over the world. Thank you very much. I really want to have you again, through the video conference or, in Seoul. Thank you very much. See you again. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.